Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We have here today Dr. James Graham and Dr. Daniel McGowan to talk about a paper that was published in Nature Medicine. The paper was actually on using AI to detect and assess Parkinson's disease using nocturnal breathing signals. Now, we'll start by talking about what are the current limitations, in terms of the screening and diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, a disease that, affects billions of people globally.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly exciting paper. To me, it represents quite a leap forward in Parkinson's disease research and has several implications moving forward. We know that Parkinson's disease is notoriously difficult to diagnose because it relies primarily on the appearance of motor symptoms, but these often appear several years after disease onset. And so to detect Parkinson's relies on a subjective medical review as well as various neuroimaging tools. But these require access to specialized medical centers and also highly trained neurologists. And so overall aren't really an option for frequent testing, whether that be for an early diagnosis or even for tracking of disease progression. And so on this point, I think the idea behind nocturnal breathing pattern analysis that's described in this paper is actually a really important advance in the diagnosing and monitoring. And that's primarily due to the high prevalence of sleep-related disorders in this population.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Julian. Hi, James. Great to be a part of this today. Thank you for the invitation. So, yeah, look, just to give some context, around 10 million people worldwide diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, but actually there's probably an awful lot, probably millions worldwide, not diagnosed. And the reason is, as James was just saying, diagnosis is very challenging. And it's often done several years after the disease has started in someone. So, a lot of people are familiar with the classical kind of motor symptoms, the rolling of the thumb and the difficulty initiating movements, the kind of pull like facial appearance and so on. But these symptoms come quite a bit later on. And, things like loss of smell and sleep disturbances and actually gut disturbances as well are sort of prodromal symptoms that appear really before the disease has been diagnosed. But often the disease has then progressed. There's a loss of neurons in particular areas of the brain. And so it's very challenging to treat the disease once it has been diagnosed, and the existing treatments can really only treat the symptoms. They can't. There are currently no treatments that can stop or slow progression. So I was really excited when I saw this paper because this is a great opportunity. It's an objective measure that can be done in the home. So you don't have to go to a clinic. It's non-invasive. So, we're not putting electrodes into people's brains. It's can be measured just through the airwaves and picking up the changes in the nocturnal breathing patterns to not only diagnose Parkinson's disease with quite good sensitivity, I should say, but also then to track the progression. Which is also really important when you want to do clinical trials testing treatments that can maybe have an impact on the disease. So, yeah, look, for me, really exciting to see this. I know a lot of people working on this in this field, trying to identify drugs or treatments that can stop or slow progression. That's the big challenge at the moment. But if we can diagnose people early and start treating them early on in the disease progression, I think that gives us a huge opportunity to really stop this disease in its tracks.
Yeah, it's really good points. And for me as well, I think this AI model that they've developed definitely represents a breakthrough in, I guess, a touchless, non-invasive system. And I think the key words here are it's objective. It can objectively recognize individuals with a high risk of PD without any of that subjective input from patient or clinician.
Yeah. Actually, I mentioned that it's probably underdiagnosed. I mean, just to mention a few problems, a few issues. There's a real shortage of trained neurologists around the world, and currently, really, only a neurologist can diagnose. And so often, people are seeing their doctors. It might be suspected. They get referred. It takes a very long time. You've also got the problem of availability or accessibility of to these services to get a diagnosis. So, people living in rural areas or in poorer countries, maybe people with no insurance, they just don't have access to a neurologist in the first place to be diagnosed. So this is something that's low cost. It can be rolled out anywhere. It's a really great opportunity to identify those people with very early stage Parkinson's.
Brilliant. And just to add to that, there was a point that you made previously about clinical trials, and I think that's another key takeaway of this paper, is that it can be used to track the severity of disease in those patients that are enrolled in clinical trials. So it's going to be speeding up drug development. And when you consider that AI is also being used to analyze and identify potential drug targets from other research groups, then the whole clinical development process is being accelerated here, from discovery through to testing and so forth.
Hugely exciting.
Yeah, I mean, this AI model is clearly a very exciting and promising area. So on that note, can you walk us through, the results and what the exact findings that the team managed to achieve?
Okay, so just to give a bit of a background to this, and also I think it's already obvious that I find this paper incredibly impressive, but I think this study not only highlights the potential of using AI to develop new diagnostic monitoring tools for PD, but it also provides new insights into the relationship between breathing disturbances and PD as well. And what I find quite incredible about this is that although using radio data is novel, the AI architecture isn't novel. The connection between breathing abnormalities and disease severity and progression also isn't particularly novel, to be honest. But the fact that this AI tool can first reliably detect how severe PD is associated with irregular breathing patterns, but also secondly that it can predict the severity of PD with high accuracy as well. And so what these researchers have done is that they've built this neural network. It's been trained and validated using a series of data sets. I think there was almost 12,000 nights worth of data and over 120,000 hours of breathing signals just from patients with Parkinson's disease. So an incredibly comprehensive and broad data set that they have access to. And pretty diverse. And it also came from different sleep study sources as well. There was an NIH-funded clinical study. There was an MIT observational study. I think there was 2 public sleep data sets as well. One from the Sleep Heart Health study and another one from the Mr. Oz sleep study. And then they also had another quite large data set from the Mayo Clinic. And that was used to develop the model and was used as an independent, it was not used to develop the model. It was instead used as an independent data set for model validation. Yeah, so a very comprehensive amount of data that was made available to them. And actually, I feel like these are a fairly privileged group of researchers in terms of their access to this data sets. And also that's coming from several very large hospitals in the US.
Yeah, I think you raise a key point there, James. I think, the richness and depth of the data set that they had, but also the diversity in that. You just mentioned actually that the data came from several different hospitals. It came from other studies actually that were around sleep, around breathing, not necessarily Parkinson's, but would contain within the set of subjects that were being studied some Parkinson's patients as well. So all of these data really add up to a really rich data set that the researchers had access to. to try and discriminate, first of all, discriminate Parkinson's from non-Parkinson's, but then also to match the changes in the patterns in nocturnal breathing to the severity of Parkinson's in that patient. And I thought one of the really interesting things, there was a study there. There were two different time points, James, that at the early time point, they had some Parkinson's patients, but quite a few non. And then at the second time point, which if I recall correctly, I think it was a year or 2 years later, they had a whole lot more Parkinson's patients in that group. And so they were able to compare, for those people who had a diagnosis by the second time point, they were able to compare the nocturnal breathing patterns between their first visit and their second, which I just thought was fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And the advantages of using AI is that you can take multiple data points and you can then aggregate those to then understand whether or not Parkinson's disease is present. And when you consider what tools a clinician has available to them in terms of asking questions and monitoring disease history and current symptoms and signs, those are usually just one time point, because you can't get the patient to come in several days in a row to then aggregate that data, particularly, as you already mentioned, if they are living in a rural area.
Yeah, so they can be monitored on a nightly basis almost, and
Yes.
you know, it's very low cost, it's non-invasive, they can be remote. So it's absolutely, yeah, really, really exciting to see that people can use this tech then and feed into broader studies looking at those nocturnal breathing patterns. Absolutely.
Well, it's really heartening to know that such a system could eventually be deployed to the homes of patients with PD. Right. But nonetheless, future research is still required to establish the feasibility of such a device. Now, so what are some of the existing matters or gaps that still need to be addressed before that reality can be fulfilled?
Further validation. Yeah, look, you know, I'm obviously I come from the Parkinson side. I can't really speak about the AI model or the data, but actually it was impressive, the level of sensitivity and specificity they had, and I think that was really down to the richness of the data set. So that was brilliant. But I would add that, you know, a diagnosis, I think, really still requires a human. I think, you know, you still want clinicians to be looking at these people and asking them questions and talking to them, monitoring them. But it can be a first step that can actually be a trigger for someone who maybe doesn't even know they have a problem, have this particular disease, to go and see a clinician and get referred and see a neurologist. So I think, yes, there's a whole lot of work to do, but I think it can almost act as an initial screening to get people into a system where they can have a proper diagnosis, and then potentially go on to clinical trials as well, where we have a real chance of you know, slowing progression if we can test some of the novel drugs coming through in that group of early PD.
Yeah, and just to expand on one of those points that you just raised there, this study doesn't show any differences between PD and different PD subtypes. Although they did show that there was they could discriminate between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Other neurodegenerative disorders, or even psychological disorders as well, they still need to work on different patient sets so that they can continue to show that they have that sensitivity and that they do have that specificity.
So, Julian, you've probably heard of the Michael J. Fox Foundation in the US. That's one of the bigger funders of Parkinson's research. I think most people will have. Look, they're putting a lot of money at the moment into this progression biomarkers initiative that they fund, and there is a real need to have these biomarkers. And, you know, as we sort of touched on before, when you come to do clinical trials, if you want to know if a particular treatment is having a genuine impact on a patient, you really need some sort of marker, some sort of outcome that you can monitor over time. And the problem we have at the moment is, you know, if we're relying on the kind of current analysis, which is very subjective, it's it involves a number of questions and a clinician looking at the movement of a patient, which often those symptoms can progress very slowly as well. So trials therefore need to be over a number of years. The nice thing that this digital biomarker, which is the terminology the authors use, and I quite like that. That's exactly what it is. It's a digital biomarker. The advantage of this is that it is changing over time, and it can be monitored, it can be measured objectively, and therefore those trials can be a lot shorter. We're not having to send people to go and see neurologists or travel if they're in remote areas. So yeah, it's a great opportunity.
Yep. So clearly, this is a very remarkable study. But to round things up and to take a zoom out of this study, to your knowledge, what are some of the current efforts in contributing to the field of screening and diagnosing Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, I mean, in Parkinson's research, AI is being used to analyze a lot of different data sources, including things like patient records, imaging studies, wearable devices, all with an aim to develop algorithms that can identify the early signs of Parkinson's before those motor symptoms appear. Now, this study involved researchers from MIT, Boston University, the Mayo Clinic, so a very diverse collaboration. And as Daniel's already mentioned, the Michael J. Fox Foundation is putting a lot of money into this. And so there's a lot of very, very big groups that are working on using AI within Parkinson's disease. There are a number of different studies looking at treatment optimization, monitoring of motor symptoms, even speech analysis or handwriting analysis, and then mentioning about digital biomarkers, but there's a lot of other different biomarkers that are being developed for PD that could be used to improve diagnosis, track disease progression, but also monitor the response to treatment as well.
Absolutely. And there was a paper out last year actually in Alzheimer's disease research that showed there was a serum biomarker that could be detected and actually showed or was linked to Alzheimer's disease years before clinical diagnosis. So they had a bunch of samples in a biobank and were able to analyze these, and they found that actually, there were changes years before clinical diagnosis. So it'd be great to have something similar to that for Parkinson's, but there's still controversy around the pathology and pathological hallmarks, but I know people that are looking at some of the earliest affected places, so not even in the brain actually, but in the nose and the gut, where it's thought Parkinson's can perhaps originate, or the pathology originates and propagates from both those regions into the brain actually years later, causing a loss of neurons, particularly vulnerable neurons in a region of the brain that relate to motor symptoms. But yeah, so I am aware of groups that are looking at those other parts of the body and those changes that perhaps have an earlier impact, but the symptoms are perhaps a little more tolerable by patients, and that's obviously a factor in non-diagnosis as well.
Yeah, I saw a paper from one of the neurology units at Cambridge Uni, and they're using AI to analyze various brain scans and trying to identify changes that may indicate the early stages of PD, which are before you see those motor symptoms. I think they're also working on a smartphone app that can detect some of the really early subtle changes in handwriting that may also be an early sign of Parkinson's disease.
Great. There certainly is a lot to look forward to in terms of using AI to address the unsolved challenges in not just the neuroscience research field, but also in the general biomedical field too. With that, thank you very much, James and Dan. We hope to get you back soon to talk about
Thank you, Julian.
more about this topic. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you both.
Thank you. Cheers.